He took her house, her savings, everything, except one place he thought wasn't worth a dime. The morning Lillian opened the envelope, the coffee was still warm in her hands. The house looked the same. The table, the chair, the quiet, all untouched. But line by line, her life was already gone, signed away years before she realized it, and the only thing left to her name was a forgotten cottage by the sea no one had cared about in decades. If you were in her place, would you walk away or go see what's left? The coffee maker clicked twice before it started. Lillian Hart stood in the kitchen, one hand resting lightly on the counter, listening to the slow drip as if it meant something. The sound had been the same for years, predictable, steady. It filled the space in a way that made the house feel occupied, even when it wasn't. She reached for the cupboard above the sink and opened it halfway, then stopped. The mugs were already lined up, each one turned with the handle facing out. She had done that the night before. Still, she adjusted one of them, a small movement, barely noticeable, just enough to feel like she'd corrected something. The morning light came in thin through the blinds. It landed across the floor in pale stripes, catching the edge of a chair leg, the corner of the rug, the faint scuff marks that never quite came clean, no matter how often she tried. "Hold on," she said quietly, though there was no one to answer. A soft sound came from the hallway. The cat appeared a moment later, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. Jasper was nearly 15 now, his fur thinning along his back, his steps careful. He paused at the threshold of the kitchen and looked up at her, waiting. "I know," she said. She bent down with a slight stiffness in her knees, reaching for the small dish by the fridge. The scoop of food made a soft rustling sound as it fell into the bowl. Jasper didn't move until she stepped away. Then he crossed the floor and lowered himself beside it, eating with the quiet concentration of something that didn't waste energy. Lillian straightened and rubbed her hands together once, as if brushing off something invisible. The coffee had finished brewing. She poured a cup, watching the dark liquid rise, the thin curl of steam drifting upward. For a moment, she just stood there with it in her hand, not drinking, not moving. The smell was stronger than she remembered it being. Or maybe the house was just quieter now. She carried the cup to the small table by the window. 2 chairs. She had thought about moving one of them, more than once. It would make sense, wouldn't it? More space, less to walk around. But every time she considered it, something in her paused. So the second chair stayed where it had always been, pushed in neatly, unused. She sat down. Outside, the street was still. A car passed slowly, tires whispering against the pavement. Somewhere farther off, a dog barked once, then again, then stopped. The neighborhood had that early morning hush, like it hadn't fully decided to wake up yet. Lillian took a sip of coffee. Too hot. She held it in her mouth anyway before swallowing, letting the heat settle. It gave her something to focus on, something immediate. Her eyes drifted across the kitchen. The small things. A dish towel folded too carefully over the oven handle, a stack of unopened mail near the corner of the counter, the clock above the doorway ticking just slightly louder than it used to. She noticed everything. She always had. That was how you kept things running, how you avoided problems before they started. You paid attention. You adjusted. You made sure nothing slipped. It had been her job for 30 years. Clinic administrator, schedules, records, details, 100 moving parts, and she had kept them all in place. People used to come to her with questions, with confusion, with things they didn't understand. She had liked that. Knowing how things worked. She took another sip of coffee, This one's smaller. Jasper finished eating and moved toward her, jumping carefully onto the chair across from her. Not the empty one. The other chair she kept near the wall. He circled once, then settled, his tail curling around his paws. "You're getting picky," she said. He blinked at her. For a moment she smiled. Just a little. Then it faded, not abruptly, but the way a sound fades when it moves farther away. The house held the silence again. She stood up, carrying her cup back to the sink, rinsed it out even though she wasn't finished, set it upside down on the drying rack. Another small correction. Her hand moved automatically to the counter, straightening the stack of mail without looking at it. She didn't need to. Bills, notices, things that arrived whether you were ready for them or not. She pressed her palm lightly against the top envelope, flattening it. Then she turned away. The clock ticked. A minute passed. Then another. And just as she reached for the dish towel again, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the house, sharp and unfamiliar in the quiet. Lillian froze for half a second, her hand still midair. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her first thought was a delivery. Something small. Maybe something she'd ordered and forgotten about. It happened more often lately. She wiped her hands on the towel and walked toward the front door, her steps measured, unhurried. The hallway felt longer than usual. She passed the mirror by the coat rack and caught a glimpse of herself, gray hair pulled back neatly, a cardigan she'd worn too many times to count. She paused just long enough to smooth the front of it, then continued. The bell didn't ring again. Whoever it was, they were waiting. She reached the door and opened it. A man stood on the porch. Not a delivery driver, no box, no clipboard with a signature pad, just a thin envelope in his hand and a neutral expression that didn't quite land on polite or unfriendly, somewhere in between. "Ms. Hart?" he asked. "Yes." He held out the envelope. "Delivery for you. Please confirm receipt." His voice was flat, practiced. She took the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. "Do I need to sign anything?" she asked. "No, ma'am. This one's just hand-delivered." Just. The word lingered in the air for a moment longer than it should have. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, already turning away, stepping off the porch with the same quiet efficiency he'd arrived with. Lillian closed the door. The house felt different. Not louder. Not colder. Just shifted. She stood there in the entryway, the envelope resting in her hands. The paper was thick, official, her name printed clearly across the front. No return address she recognized. She walked back into the kitchen, slower this time. Set the envelope on the table. Jasper lifted his head, watching her. "It's probably nothing," she said, though she hadn't opened it yet. She pulled out the chair and sat down. For a moment, she didn't touch it, just looked at it. Then, carefully, she slid her finger under the edge and opened the seal. The paper inside unfolded with a soft, deliberate sound. She began to read. And somewhere, deep and quiet, something in the room changed in a way that couldn't be put back. The coffee maker, still warm on the counter, clicked once as it cooled. And the morning, the ordinary, steady morning she had just been moving through, was gone. Lillian didn't move for a long time. The paper rested in her hands, edges crisp, heavier now that she understood what it carried. Her eyes stayed fixed on the same paragraph, though she had already read it twice, maybe 3 times. The words didn't blur. They stayed sharp, clear. That was the problem. She set the pages down slowly on the table. Jasper shifted in his chair, sensing something, though he couldn't have known what. He made a small sound in his throat and settled again, watching her with that quiet, patient attention he had always given her. Lillian reached for the top sheet again. "Okay," she said under her breath. It wasn't denial. It was habit. You read carefully. You check the details. You don't react until you understand what's in front of you. Her finger traced down the page. Legal language. Structured. Precise. Every sentence placed exactly where it needed to be. Names, dates, account numbers she recognized, though they looked different here. Formal, distant. Victor Hale. Her eyes paused on the name. She didn't say it out loud. She kept reading. The house. Transferred. Finalized. Filed weeks ago. Joint accounts. Reclassified under provisions she barely remembered signing. Retirement funds. Liquidated and redistributed. She turned the page. Her signature appeared near the bottom of one document, smaller than she remembered it being, tucked neatly into a line of text. She leaned back slightly in the chair. "That's not," she started, then stopped. It was. She remembered the day. Not clearly, not every detail, but enough. A stack of papers on the dining table, Victor standing beside her, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, explaining things in that calm, measured way he used when he wanted something to sound simple. "Just routine updates," he had said. "Standard stuff. They change the language every few years." She had asked one question, maybe two. He had answered both without hesitation. She had signed. Lillian lowered her gaze back to the document. Her name again. Another page. Another signature. Each one placed carefully, exactly where it needed to be. Not rushed. Not forced. Given. The room felt smaller. Not physically. The walls hadn't moved. The ceiling was still where it had always been. But something in the air had shifted, pressing in just slightly from all sides. She stood up. The chair made a soft sound against the floor. She carried the papers to the counter, laying them flat beside the stack of unopened mail she had straightened earlier. For a moment, she looked at both piles as if they belonged to the same category. They didn't. She pulled open a drawer and took out a pen, then a small notepad she kept near the phone. Sat down again. If something didn't make sense, you wrote it out. She had done that her whole life. Column by column, step by step. Her handwriting was steady. Date of document. Transfer amount. Account reference. She moved through the pages slowly, copying details, building a timeline without quite deciding to. It didn't take long before the pattern started to form. Weeks ago, months ago. Some things even earlier. She paused, pen hovering over the paper. "That doesn't line up," she murmured. She flipped back 2 pages, compared dates, checked them again. No mistake. The transfers had been staged. Small movements at first, nothing large enough to raise concern, then larger ones, spaced out just enough to avoid attention. She sat back. Her eyes moved to the phone on the wall. It hung there, quiet, unchanged. The same place it had always been. She didn't pick it up. Not yet. Instead, she reached for the next page. A summary. Clean. Final. The language was almost polite. All assets accounted for. All parties notified. all terms considered binding. Lillian let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Binding, she repeated softly. The word settled in the room. Jasper shifted again, jumping down from the chair and walking toward her. He brushed lightly against her leg, then circled once before sitting at her feet. She reached down automatically, resting her hand on his back. Warm, familiar. Real. The papers weren't moving. The numbers weren't changing. She looked at her notes, then back at the documents. There was no single moment where it all collapsed. No sharp break, just a slow, tightening understanding. This hadn't happened suddenly. It had been built. Planned. Layer by layer. Her hand stilled on the cat's back. Okay, she said again, quieter this time. Not to reassure herself, just to mark the moment. She stood and walked to the sink, turned the faucet on, let the water run over her hands longer than necessary. The sound filled the kitchen, drowning out the clock for a few seconds. When she turned it off, the silence came back heavier. She dried her hands carefully on the towel, folded it again. Set it back exactly where it had been. Another small correction. Her eyes drifted once more to the phone. This time she stepped toward it. She lifted the receiver, paused, then set it back down. No, not yet. She turned instead and walked down the hallway. The bedroom door was half open. Inside, everything was as it had been. The bed made neatly, the dresser cleared except for a small tray of things she used every day, the closet door closed. Nothing had changed here, and yet, she crossed to the dresser and opened the top drawer. Inside were folders, old ones, documents she had kept over the years without much thought, insurance papers, tax returns, copies of things she had signed and filed away. She pulled one out, then another, carried them back to the kitchen, spread them across the table beside the new documents, compared signatures, dates, language. Her movements were slower now, more deliberate. She wasn't searching for a mistake anymore. She was confirming what she already knew. After a while, she stopped. The pen lay across the notepad. The papers formed small, neat stacks around it. Jasper had curled up again, this time beneath the table. The house was quiet. Exactly as it had been before the doorbell rang. Lillian looked down at her name on the page one last time. Then she gathered the documents together, aligning the edges with careful precision, and set them in a single pile. Not hidden, not put away, just placed. She pulled out the chair and sat. The second chair across from her remained empty. For a moment, her eyes rested on it. Then it looked back at the papers, and the realization, now complete, settled into something solid and unmoving. This hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been rushed. It hadn't even been recent. It had been happening quietly, while everything else looked the same. She exhaled slowly, and for the first time since opening the envelope, she stopped trying to make it make sense. The papers stayed where they were. Neat, aligned, final. Lillian sat at the table a while longer, her hands resting flat on either side of the stack, as if keeping it from moving. Outside, the light had shifted. The thin morning gray had brightened into something sharper, more definite. The day was continuing, whether she followed it or not. Jasper stirred beneath the table, then pushed himself up and padded into the hallway. His nails clicked softly against the floorboards. The sound faded, as he disappeared into the bedroom. Lillian watched him go. Then she stood. There were things to do. That thought came not from urgency, but from instinct. You didn't sit still too long when something was wrong. You moved. You checked. You accounted for what you had. She walked to the small cabinet near the fridge and opened it. Inside, tucked behind a row of neatly stacked containers, was a narrow metal box. She pulled it out and carried it to the table. The lid lifted with a faint metallic scrape. Inside were the pieces of her life that didn't live out in the open. A spare set of keys, a passport she hadn't used in years, a few folded documents, receipts from things long paid for and forgotten. She began to sort through them. Carefully. Not searching for anything specific, just taking stock. Her fingers moved slowly, pausing now and then on items that carried weight she hadn't noticed before. A receipt from a hardware store. A warranty for an appliance Victor had insisted they needed. A card from a doctor's office dated nearly a decade back. She set each one aside, kept only what mattered, or what might. When she reached the bottom of the box, her hand stopped. An envelope. Yellowed at the edges, thicker than the rest. She recognized it immediately. Not because she had opened it, because she hadn't. Her name was written across the front in a small, steady hand. Not Victor's, not hers. Her grandmother's. Lillian lifted it out slowly. For a moment, she just held it there, her thumb brushing lightly over the crease where the paper had been folded years ago. The ink had faded slightly, but the shape of the letters remained firm, deliberate. She had received it after the funeral. She remembered that much. It had arrived in a stack of things, condolences, official notices, small reminders that a life had ended and needed to be accounted for. She had set it aside, told herself she would read it when things settled. Things never had. She turned the envelope over. Still sealed. Jasper reappeared in the doorway, watching her again. He didn't come closer this time, just stood there, quiet. Lillian drew in a breath. Then she opened it. The paper inside unfolded more easily than she expected. There was no formal greeting. Just a few lines, written plainly. Lillian. If you are reading this, it means I waited too long to say things out loud. The cottage is yours, not because it's worth anything, but because it's yours. Don't let anyone tell you what it is or isn't. Go see it before you decide. Grandma Lillian read it once, then again. The words were simple, almost too simple. No explanation, no instructions. Just that, the cottage. She hadn't thought about it in years. Oregon coast. Brindle Point. A place she had visited as a child, maybe twice. She remembered the smell of salt and something damp in the air, the sound of wind that didn't seem to stop, her grandmother standing near the edge of something, cliff, maybe, pointing out into the distance, talking about things Lillian hadn't fully understood at the time. Later, Victor had called it a liability. Rotting wood on bad land, he had said once, flipping through papers at the kitchen table. Costs more to maintain than it's worth. She had nodded. Let it go. She looked back at the letter. Not because it's worth anything. The phrase sat differently now. Lillian folded the paper carefully and set it beside the legal documents. Then she turned back to the metal box. There were a few more things to go through. A small folder labeled in her own handwriting, Property. She opened it. Inside were old copies, Deeds, insurance forms, tax statements, things she hadn't reviewed in years because there had never been a reason to. Until now. She pulled out the document at the bottom. Brindle Point. Her name was there. Sole ownership. No joint signature. No shared account reference. Just her. Lillian sat back slowly. "That's still mine," she said, not quite aloud. The realization didn't come with relief. Not yet. It came with something else. Direction. She placed the document on the table beside the letter, looked at both, then around the kitchen, the cabinets, the chairs, the walls that had held the shape of her life for so long. None of it was hers. Not anymore. She stood and walked to the window. The street outside looked the same as it had that morning. Same car parked across the way, same trimmed hedges, same quiet order. It all felt finished. She pressed her hand lightly against the glass. Cold. Then she turned back. The table, the papers, the letter. The only things left that didn't belong to Victor's careful, quiet planning. She walked to the hallway and opened the closet. Inside were 2 suitcases. She pulled one down, set it on the bed, opened it. For a moment she just stood there, looking at the empty space inside. Then she moved. Not quickly, not hurried, but with a kind of steady intention that hadn't been there before. A few clothes, practical ones, the cardigan she wore most often, a pair of shoes that could handle uneven ground. She paused once, holding a blouse she hadn't worn in years, looked at it, then folded it anyway. Jasper jumped onto the bed and settled near the edge of the suitcase, watching her. "You're coming," she said. It wasn't a question. Back in the kitchen, the papers remained where she had left them. Lillian gathered them into a folder, not to hide them, to carry them. The letter went in last. She closed the folder and placed it on top of the suitcase. Then she stood there for a moment, her hand resting on it. The house was quiet. Exactly as it had been. But it no longer felt like something she needed to maintain or protect or understand. She turned off the kitchen light, though it was still daytime. A habit. Then she walked back to the bedroom, where the suitcase waited, half-filled, open. And for the first time since the envelope had arrived, she knew what she was going to do next. Not because it made sense, but because there was nothing else left to stay for. The drive took longer than she expected. Lillian kept both hands on the wheel, steady at 10 and 2, the way she had learned decades ago and never unlearned. The highway stretched out in front of her, pale gray under a sky that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to clear or stay heavy. Jasper had settled into the passenger seat early on, curled into himself with the quiet trust of something that didn't ask questions. Every now and then he lifted his head, blinking at the shifting light, then tucked himself back down again. She hadn't turned the radio on. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It just was. Gas stations came and went. Small towns slipped by without names she remembered. She stopped once, just long enough to refill the tank and use the restroom. The woman behind the counter had asked if she wanted a receipt. Lillian had nodded, folded it carefully, and placed it in her bag without thinking. Another habit. By the time the road narrowed and the air began to change, she noticed it without needing to name it. Salt. Faint at first, then stronger. The trees shifted too, taller, thinner, bending slightly, as if they had learned over time to lean away from something constant. The ocean wasn't visible yet, but it made itself known. A low, steady sound under everything else. She slowed as the sign appeared on the right side of the road. Brindle Point. The letters were weathered, the paint peeling at the edges. She passed it without stopping. The town itself was small. A gas station, a diner with a crooked sign, a post office no larger than a single-car garage, a few houses set back from the road, some with porches that leaned just slightly to one side, as if the ground beneath them had shifted over time. No one looked at her as she drove through. Or if they did, they didn't show it. She followed the directions she had written down earlier, copying them from the old property documents. Left at the split in the road. Continue past the old fence line. Follow until the pavement ends. The pavement did end. It gave way to a narrow gravel road that curved along the edge of something she still couldn't see but could feel. Open space, wide and uncontained. Branches scraped lightly against the side of the car as she drove. The sound was soft, irregular. Not enough to damage anything, just enough to remind her that this road wasn't meant for careful driving. Jasper stirred, lifting his head. "It's okay," she said. Her voice sounded different out here. Quieter. The road climbed slightly, then leveled out. And then, without warning, it opened. The ocean stretched out in front of her. Gray, endless, moving. Lillian slowed the car to a near stop. The sound she had been hearing beneath everything else now filled the space completely. Waves striking rock, pulling back, returning again. Not gentle, not soft. Constant. She let the car roll forward until she saw it. The cottage. It sat a short distance from the edge of the bluff, angled slightly as if it had shifted over time but refused to fall. The wood siding had faded to a dull silver gray, worn smooth by years of salt and wind. One corner of the roof sagged just enough to notice. The windows were clouded, the glass uneven. It looked older than she remembered. And yet, still there. She parked the car and turned off the engine. For a moment, she didn't move. The silence inside the car felt different now, surrounded by something much larger outside it. Jasper climbed onto her lap without waiting, his small weight settling against her chest. She rested a hand on his back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. Then she opened the door. The wind met her immediately. Cool, sharp, carrying the smell of salt and something else, something mineral, deep and old. She stepped out onto the gravel, closing the door behind her. The ground beneath her feet was uneven. Small stones shifted as she walked, the sound crisp in the open air. The cottage stood quietly ahead. No movement. No sign that anyone had been there in years. And yet, as she approached, something felt off. Not wrong. Just not entirely abandoned. She climbed the short set of steps leading to the front porch. The wood creaked under her weight, but it held. The railing was rough beneath her hand, worn smooth in places where hands had rested before. She reached the door. It was closed. Not hanging open, not broken. Closed. Lillian paused. Then she reached for the handle. It turned easily, unlocked. She pushed the door open. The air inside was cooler than outside, carrying a faint scent of dust and something older. Wood, maybe, or fabric that had been left too long without movement. Light filtered in through the windows, muted and gray. The room was small. A table, a chair, a narrow counter along one wall. everything coated in a thin layer of stillness. Not chaos. Not decay. Just waiting. She stepped inside. The floorboards creaked softly under her feet. Jasper followed, staying close to her legs. Lillian moved slowly, taking in the details. The table was positioned neatly, not shoved aside or left at an angle. A cup sat near the edge, turned upright, as if it had been placed there with intention. She reached out and touched it. Dust, but not thick, not untouched. Her eyes shifted to the far wall. A set of tools leaned neatly in the corner. Hammer, pry bar, a small box of nails, organized, not scattered. She stepped closer. The wood of the handle looked newer than the rest of the room. Replaced. Her gaze moved across the floor. The boards were uneven, but in one section near the back wall, they looked different. Slightly darker, slightly smoother, as if they had been disturbed. Repaired. She crouched down, running her fingers lightly along the seam. It didn't match. Not exactly. Behind her, the wind pushed against the house, a low, steady pressure. Lillian straightened slowly. Her eyes moved to the back of the cottage. Another door. She walked toward it. This one had a lock. New, shiny against the worn wood. She touched it. Cold. Her hand lingered there for a moment. Then she stepped back. The sound of the ocean filled the silence again. Lillian turned, taking in the room once more. The cottage Victor had dismissed. Rotting wood on bad land. She looked at the floor again. At the tools. At the lock. Then back toward the open door, where the wind moved freely in and out, carrying the sound of the waves. This wasn't just left, she said quietly. Jasper flicked his tail. Lillian didn't say anything else. She stepped back onto the porch, the wind catching her hair, pulling it loose at the edges. The ocean stretched out in front of her, unchanged, indifferent. The cottage behind her stood still. Not falling, not empty. And for the first time since she had opened the envelope in her kitchen, something shifted inside her. Not fear, not relief, something quieter, a question. She turned back toward the door, and this time when she stepped inside, she wasn't just looking, she was paying attention. Lillian closed the door behind her, not fully, just enough to keep the wind from pushing it open again. The latch clicked softly, a small, contained sound that seemed to settle the room. She stood still for a moment, listening. The cottage had its own rhythm. Not silence, not noise. Something in between. The faint creak of wood adjusting. The distant pulse of the ocean pressing against the bluff. A loose pane somewhere tapping lightly when the wind shifted direction. It wasn't empty. It was holding itself together. She set her bag down on the table and walked slowly through the space again, this time without hesitation. Her hand brushed along the edge of the counter, feeling the texture of the wood, worn smooth in some places, rough in others. Someone had taken care of this once. Maybe longer than she realized. Jasper moved ahead of her, sniffing along the baseboards, pausing at corners, investigating with quiet seriousness. He stopped near the back wall where the floorboards had caught her attention earlier, and sat there, staring down as if he expected something to move. Lillian crouched beside him. "You see it too," she murmured. Her fingers pressed lightly along the seam again. Still uneven, still out of place. She stood. Not now. There were other things to handle first. The air inside the cottage felt stale, like it hadn't been turned over in a while. She moved to the front window and worked the latch open. It resisted at first. then gave with a short, dry crack. The window lifted halfway, letting in a rush of cold, salt air. The room shifted immediately. Alive again. She moved to the next window, then the next, working each one open with slow patience. Some stuck, some groaned. One refused entirely, and she made a note of it without forcing it. By the time she finished, the cottage felt different. Not clean, but breathing. She stepped back, brushing her hands together once. "All right," she said quietly. It was the same tone she had used for years when facing something that needed to be done, whether she felt ready or not. She walked back outside to the car and opened the trunk. The suitcase sat where she had placed it, half filled. She lifted it out carefully, setting it down on the gravel before reaching for the smaller bag beside it. Jasper jumped down from the porch and followed her, circling once before heading back toward the door, as if he had already decided this was where they were staying. "Don't get ahead of me," she said, though there was no real edge to it. Inside, she set the suitcase near the wall and opened it. A few clothes. Not much. Enough. She placed them neatly into a drawer she found in the corner, testing it first to make sure it opened without sticking. It did, though the wood rasped faintly as it slid. She worked slowly, not unpacking everything, just enough to make the space usable. The bed, if it could be called that, was a narrow frame with a thin mattress, covered in a sheet that had been left in place but clearly hadn't been washed in a long time. She pulled it off carefully, folding it without thinking, then paused. There was no clean replacement. She stood there for a moment, considering. Then she went back to the suitcase and pulled out the spare blanket she had packed almost as an afterthought. It wasn't meant for this, but it would do. She spread it across the mattress, smoothing it down with both hands. Better. Not perfect, but workable. Back in the main room, her eyes moved again to the tools in the corner. She walked over and picked up the hammer. It felt solid, balanced. Not old, not like the rest of the room. She turned it in her hand, noticing the clean grain of the handle, the lack of wear near the head. Used, but not worn out. She set it back exactly where it had been. Then she reached for the small box of nails, opening it just enough to see inside. Half full. Not abandoned. She closed it again. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, pressing against the side of the house. The loose pane she had heard earlier tapped again, more insistently now. Lillian glanced toward the sound. "All right," she said again. This time, there was a trace of something else in her voice. Not confidence, but willingness. She moved to the window and examined the frame. One corner had pulled away slightly, leaving a narrow gap where the wind slipped through. She pressed against it with her hand. It shifted. Not enough. She stepped back, thinking. Then she returned to the tools, selecting the pry bar this time. It took a few tries to find the right angle. The wood resisted, then gave just enough to let her reposition it. She worked carefully, not forcing it, letting the tool do most of the work the way she remembered someone once showing her. After a few minutes, the frame settled back into place. She tapped it lightly with the hammer. Once. Twice. The sound echoed briefly through the room, then faded. The gap closed. The tapping stopped. Lillian stepped back, wiping her hands on her cardigan. Her fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, from effort. She hadn't done something like that in years. Maybe longer. Jasper watched her from near the door, his tail flicking once. "Well," she said, catching her breath, "that's one thing." She looked around the cottage again. The open windows, the cleared space, the bed, simple but usable, the tools placed carefully back where she had found them. It wasn't much, but it was something. She moved to the table and pulled her notepad from her bag, the same one she had used earlier. She opened it and wrote, "Windows, open back frame, repaired. Tools, recent." She paused, then added, "Floor, uneven, back wall." She closed the notebook. Not solved, not understood, just noted. The light outside had shifted again, turning slightly warmer as the afternoon moved in. The ocean beyond the bluff caught it in uneven flashes, the surface breaking and reforming constantly. Lillian stepped out onto the porch. The wind pressed against her again, stronger now, carrying the sound of the waves more clearly. She stood there, looking out, not thinking about Victor, not thinking about the papers, just standing. Behind her, the cottage held, not falling apart, not giving in, just there. Jasper brushed against her leg, then settled at her feet. Lillian let out a slow breath. Her body ached. Her hands felt unfamiliar. But her mind was sharper than it had been that morning. She turned back toward the door. There was more to do. There would always be more to do. But for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like something she was trying to keep from breaking. It felt like something she was building, even if she didn't yet know what it was. The next morning came in colder. Lillian woke before the light fully reached the windows. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The ceiling above her looked unfamiliar, lower, uneven, the grain of the wood running at a slight angle. Then the sound came back. The ocean. Steady, persistent. She lay still, listening. Jasper was curled at her side, his breathing slow and even. The blanket had shifted during the night, and the air held a sharp edge that made her pull it closer around her shoulders. This wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't unbearable either. She sat up slowly, feeling the stiffness in her back and hands, the kind that didn't disappear right away, the kind you had to work through. "All right," she said quietly. The word carried differently here, not as a reassurance, more like a marker. She dressed in layers, practical ones, the cardigan, thicker socks, the shoes she had worn the day before. Each movement was deliberate, measured, as if she were learning her own body again. The cottage greeted her the same way it had the night before, still holding itself together. But now she noticed more. The way the floor dipped slightly near the back wall, the way the light filtered differently through each window depending on the angle of the glass, the faint scent of salt that never fully left the air. She moved to the table and opened her notebook. Read the list she had written. Windows, open back frame, repaired. Tools, recent floor, uneven back wall. Her eyes lingered on the last line. She closed the notebook. Not yet. There were other things to understand first. She stepped outside. The wind had softened overnight, though it still carried the same cold edge. The sky was clearer now, the clouds breaking apart just enough to let pale sunlight reach the water. The bluff stretched out to her right, a narrow path running along its edge. Grass bent low under the weight of the wind, revealing patches of exposed soil and stone beneath. She walked toward it, carefully. The ground was uneven, but not unstable, not recently disturbed, just worn over time by weather and whatever had passed through before. At the edge, she stopped. The drop wasn't sheer, but it was steep enough to command attention. Below, the ocean moved against the rock in slow, relentless patterns, the foam pulling back and returning again. Her grandmother had stood here. That thought came quietly, not as a memory, but as a fact. Lillian looked down at her feet. The soil near the edge showed faint impressions, not footprints exactly, just subtle changes in texture where the ground had been compacted differently. At some point. She crouched slightly, running her fingers over the surface. Not recent, but not untouched either. She stood again and turned back toward the cottage. Something wasn't lining up. She felt it before she understood it. Back inside, she went straight to the folder she had brought with her. The property documents. She spread them across the table, smoothing each page carefully. Deed, tax record, boundary description. The language was precise, structured the same way as the documents she had reviewed the day before. Clear measurements, defined edges. She traced the lines with her finger. North boundary, marked by tree line. South boundary, extending to coastal edge. She paused. Extending to coastal edge. Her eyes moved back to the window, where the bluff stretched out beyond what she could fully see from inside. Then back to the paper. She reached for the old envelope again. Her grandmother's letter sat folded where she had left it. She opened it, not because she expected more words, but because something about it felt unfinished. Nothing new. Just the same simple lines. But beneath it, tucked into the envelope, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A second piece of paper, thinner, folded twice. Lillian pulled it out slowly, unfolded it. It wasn't formal. No printed lines, no official markings. Just a hand-drawn map. Simple, rough, but deliberate. The cottage was marked with a small square. The bluff extended outward, sketched in uneven lines, and farther along, beyond where the official documents had stopped, was another section. A narrow path. A small inlet. Unlabeled. Her grandmother's handwriting appeared near the edge. Keep track. Lillian stared at it. Then she reached for the official boundary description again. Compared them. Once, twice. The difference was subtle at first. Then it wasn't. The official map stopped short. Cut cleanly along a line that didn't match the natural curve of the land. The hand-drawn map continued. Further. Beyond what had been recorded. That's not right, she said quietly. She stood, gathering both papers, and walked back outside. The wind caught them slightly, but she held them firm. She followed the path along the bluff again, this time with purpose. Counting steps, watching the ground, matching what she saw to what had been drawn. The path narrowed as she moved farther out. The grass thinned, replaced by patches of bare earth and stone. Then she saw it. A split in the rock. Narrow. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. She stepped closer. The inlet opened just beyond, partially hidden from the main view. The water there moved differently, quieter, more contained, protected. Lillian stood there for a long moment. The official documents didn't include this. Not fully. Not accurately. She turned back toward the cottage, then down at the map again. Keep track. Her grandmother's words. Not instructions. A warning. Lillian folded the map carefully and held it alongside the official papers. They didn't match. And not in a way that could be explained by age or error. This was something else. Something that had been changed or left out. She walked back to the cottage slowly, her steps more deliberate now. Inside, she laid the documents out again, side by side. The difference was undeniable now that she had seen it in person. The land extended further than it should have, according to the official records. Or the records had been shortened. Her eyes moved between the two, back and forth, measuring, comparing. The same way she had done at the kitchen table the day before. Only this time, it wasn't her name being moved. It was the land. She reached for her notebook and wrote, "Boundary mismatch, coastal edge, hand map extends further inlet, not recorded." She paused, then added, "Check records." Her hand stilled for a moment. The decision formed without effort. She would go into town, find the county office, look at the older records. Not because she expected an answer, but because something here didn't add up. And she knew that feeling. She had spent her life listening to it. This time, she wasn't going to ignore it. The drive into town felt shorter than the day before. Not because the road had changed. Because she had. Lillian kept the folded map and the official documents on the passenger seat beside her, one hand occasionally resting over them as if to keep them from shifting, though the car moved smoothly along the narrow road. Brindle Point looked the same as it had when she passed through, quiet, contained, almost forgotten. The diner's sign still leaned slightly to the left. The gas station stood with its single pump, no one in sight. She parked in front of a low building with a faded sign, County Records. The door stuck slightly when she pushed it open. Inside, the air was warmer, carrying the faint smell of paper and something older. Dust, maybe, or time itself settling into corners. A bell chimed softly as the door closed behind her. There was no one at the front desk. Just a long counter, a few chairs, and shelves behind it lined with binders and boxes. Lillian stepped forward, her shoes making a quiet sound against the floor. "Hello," she called. Her voice echoed slightly, then faded. A moment passed. Then a man appeared from a side room, wiping his hands on a cloth. Mid-50s, maybe, slightly stooped, as if he had spent most of his time leaning over things. "Can I help you?" he asked. His tone wasn't unfriendly, just careful. "Yes," Lillian said. "I'm looking for property records, older ones, for Brindle Point." He studied her for a second. "Which property?" She gave him the details. Her name. The parcel. He nodded once, slowly. "Those go back a ways," he said. "Most of what we have is digitized now, but the older maps, those are in storage." "That's fine," she said. He hesitated. Not long, just enough to notice. "All right," he said finally. "Give me a minute." He disappeared again. Lillian stood at the counter, her fingers resting lightly on the edge. The room was quiet in a different way than the cottage, contained, organized, every sound softened by the presence of paper. She glanced around. Nothing unusual, nothing that would explain the feeling that had settled in her chest since she had compared the maps. The man returned carrying a large, flat folder. He set it on the counter carefully. "These are the original surveys," he said. "60s, maybe earlier. Haven't been pulled in a while." "Thank you." He stepped back, giving her space. Lillian opened the folder. The paper inside was thicker, heavier, the lines drawn by hand, not printed. Ink slightly faded, but still clear. She laid the first map flat. Her eyes moved across it slowly, then stopped. The boundary line extended further, just as her grandmother's map had shown. The inlet, the narrow path, all of it marked, documented, official. She turned to the next page. Another survey, same extension, same coastline. Her fingers pressed lightly against the paper. Why was this changed? She asked, not looking up. The man shifted slightly. What do you mean? She turned the folder so he could see. The current records stop here, she said, pointing to the shortened boundary. But these don't. He leaned forward, studied it, then leaned back again. Looks like a revision, he said. Happens sometimes. Lines get redrawn. Why? He shrugged. Could be anything. Erosion, disputes, new measurements. But this isn't erosion, Lillian said quietly. The land is still there. He didn't answer that. Instead, he picked up one of the older maps and flipped it over. There should be notes attached to any changes, he said, if they were filed properly. Were they? He gave a small, non-committal shrug. Depends on the year. Lillian held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Is there a record of the revision? He hesitated again, then turned toward the back room. I'll check. When he was gone, the room felt quieter than before. Lillian looked back down at the maps. The lines were clear. Undeniable. This wasn't a small adjustment. It was a removal. A section of land simply gone from the official record. She folded her grandmother's map open beside the survey, aligned the edges, compared them carefully. The same curve, the same inlet, the same path. Her grandmother hadn't guessed. She had known. The man returned with a thinner file. Set it on the counter. Revision notes, he said. Lillian opened it. The pages inside were different. Typed. Formal. Dates, signatures. Her eyes moved quickly now, searching, finding. There, a reference to boundary adjustment, filed under a company name she didn't recognize. Reason listed as survey correction. No detailed explanation. No updated measurements included. Just a clean, final statement. Approved. Lillian felt something tighten in her chest. Who approved this? She asked. The man leaned over again, reading. Looks like it went through the state office, he said. Not local. And the land? He glanced at her. What about it? Who owns the part that was removed? He straightened. That would depend on what it was reassigned to, he said, if it was reassigned at all. And if it wasn't? He gave a small, humorless smile. Then it's just unaccounted for. The word settled heavily between them. Unaccounted. Lillian closed the file slowly. Her hands were steady. But her thoughts weren't. Not scattered. Focused. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't erosion. It wasn't time. It was something done. Deliberately. She gathered the copies she had made, stacking them neatly. Can I take these? She asked. Copies, yes. Originals stay here. That's fine. He watched her for a moment. You planning to do something with this? He asked. Lillian met his eyes. I'm planning to understand it, she said. He nodded once, didn't ask anything else. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Lillian stepped out of the building, the papers held firmly against her side. The ocean was louder here, even from town. Or maybe she was just hearing it differently. She walked back to her car, set the documents on the seat, sat down behind the wheel. For a moment, she didn't start the engine, just sat there, looking at the papers, then at the road ahead, the cottage, the floorboards, the tools, the lock. And now, this. Her grandmother hadn't just left her a place. She had left her something else, something that had been hidden, changed, taken. Lillian started the car, turned it toward the road leading back to the bluff. This time, she wasn't returning to figure out if she could stay. She was returning to find out what had been buried there. The road back felt different. Not longer, not shorter, just sharper. Lillian drove with the windows cracked open, the cold air cutting through the car in steady currents. The papers beside her lifted slightly with each turn, edges shifting against one another, like they were restless, too. She didn't slow when the pavement ended, didn't hesitate when the gravel took over. The cottage came into view the same way it had before, quiet, unchanged, waiting. But she didn't stop on the porch this time. She went straight inside. Jasper followed close behind, his movements quicker now, alert. Lillian set the documents down on the table without arranging them. That alone felt like a break in habit. Then she walked to the back wall. The uneven floorboards. She crouched again, pressing her fingers along the seams. They knew, she said quietly. Not a question. The difference in the records wasn't something small. It wasn't something you overlooked. It was something you hid. Her grandmother had drawn the full boundary. Someone else had erased part of it. Lillian stood and moved to the corner where the tools rested. This time she didn't study them. She picked up the pry bar. The metal felt cold in her hand. She carried it back to the floor and knelt again. Jasper watched from a few feet away, his ears angled forward, body still. All right, she murmured. She slid the edge of the pry bar into the seam between the boards. The wood resisted. She adjusted the angle, pressed again. This time it gave slightly. A faint cracking sound. Not breaking. Loosening. Lillian paused, listening. The cottage held steady. The wind pressed against the walls. Nothing else moved. She leaned her weight into it, slowly. The board lifted just enough for her to grip it with her fingers. She set the tool aside and worked the edge carefully, easing it up without forcing it. It took time, more than she expected. Her hands slipped once, twice. She adjusted her grip, stayed patient. Finally, the board came free. She set it aside. Beneath it, another layer. Not empty space, not dirt. A narrow compartment framed with wood that looked older than the rest. Deliberate. Hidden. Lillian leaned closer. There was something inside. A metal box. Smaller than she expected. Sealed. She reached down and lifted it out. Heavier than it looked. She sat back on her heels, the box resting in her lap. For a moment, she didn't open it, just held it there. The wind outside rose and fell. The ocean moved beyond the bluff, steady and unchanged. Jasper stepped closer, sniffing lightly at the edge of the box, then pulling back. "It's all right," she said. She found the latch. Simple. No lock. Just closed. She opened it. Inside were papers. Not loose, stacked, bound with twine. Lillian set the box on the floor and untied the bundle carefully. The top sheet was handwritten. Her grandmother's writing again. Clear. Even. Not rushed. Lillian read. Records of visits, names, dates, references to survey teams, to meetings, to conversations that had never been formalized. She turned the page. Maps. Not rough this time. Precise. Detailed. Showing the coastline exactly as it existed, not as it had been reduced. Another page. Correspondence. Typed letters. Requests for clarification. Questions about boundary changes. Unanswered, or answered vaguely. She kept reading. The pattern became clear. Repeated attempts, repeated dismissals. Her grandmother had known, had tried to address it, and when that failed, she had documented everything. Carefully, quietly, thoroughly. Lillian's hands stilled on the page. She kept it all, she said softly. Not just the land. The truth of it. The effort to protect it. The refusal to let it disappear without record. She flipped to another section. More recent. Closer to the time her grandmother had passed. The writing changed slightly. Still steady. But tighter. More urgent. References to a company. The same name she had seen in the county file. Again and again. Meetings requested. Ignored. Boundary disputes filed. Closed without resolution. Lillian felt the weight of it settle in her chest. This hadn't been a single decision. It had been a process. A slow taking. One line at a time. She sat back, the papers spread around her now, no longer contained. Jasper moved closer, settling beside her. The room felt different again. Not just lived in, not just held together. Witnessing, she reached for her notebook, opened it, and began to write. Company name, repeated. Survey revisions, incomplete. Grandmother records, detailed, consistent, hidden, intentionally. Her pen moved steadily. No hesitation now. No uncertainty. Just the quiet, focused rhythm she had always relied on. When she finished, she set the notebook aside. Looked at the papers again, then at the open space beneath the floor. This wasn't something she could keep to herself. Not anymore. She gathered the documents carefully, stacking them in order, returning them to the box, but not sealing it. Then she stood. Carried it to the table. Set it down beside the official records, side by side. Two versions of the same story. One erased, one preserved. Lillian walked to the window. The ocean stretched out in front of her, unchanged by any document, any line drawn on paper. They didn't think anyone would check, she said. The words came easily now, not from anger, from clarity. She turned back to the table, picked up the folder, then the box. This time, when she looked at them, she wasn't just seeing information. She was seeing proof. And proof meant something. She didn't know exactly what yet. But she knew where to start. The town. The legal office she had passed earlier. People who understood how to read this kind of thing. Not to explain it to her, but to confirm what she already saw. Jasper stood as she moved toward the door. "Come on," she said. Outside, the wind pressed against her again. Stronger now. The sky darker at the edges. The cottage behind her stood firm. No longer just a place she had come to. A place that had been waiting. Lillian stepped into the open air, the box held steady in her hands. She wasn't just uncovering something hidden. She was stepping into something that had already begun long before she arrived. And she wasn't turning away from it. The wind pressed against her coat as she stood at the edge of the bluff, the box still in her hands. Below, the water moved the same way it always had, pulling in, letting go, returning again. She thought about the kitchen she'd left behind, the careful routines, the quiet way things had been taken from her, piece by piece, without noise. And then she thought about her grandmother. A woman who had seen something wasn't right, and instead of arguing, instead of waiting for someone to listen, she had written it down, measured it, tracked it, hidden it where no one could erase it. Not louder, just more certain. Lillian looked back at the cottage, at the boards she had lifted with her own hands, at the truth that had been sitting there all along, waiting for someone willing to notice. She hadn't lost everything. She had just never been shown what was still hers. The ocean shifted again, steady and patient, as if it had been holding that truth the entire time. And standing there, with the wind in her face and the past finally laid open in her hands, she realized something quietly, without needing to say it out loud. Some things aren't taken from you all at once. They're given away slowly, until one day you stop and ask yourself, when did you start believing you had nothing left?